At the same time, there could be active investigations going on from what they call a HIDTA team, high impact drug trafficking. Okay, maybe Xana, maybe her mom. You got a drug train going because they think it's a drug hit, because they think it's a drug hit, because they think it's a drug hit.
It almost makes me think that maybe he had some type of a hazmat suit on.
Can see through you, see your true color.
Like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun.
I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Listen to Pavarotti. Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And man, let me tell you, it's amazing what actual evidence, when it's all put out there and people actually start to read it, they start to come out of their fog just a little bit. I mean, it's going to take quite some time for them to come all the way out of their fog, but at least they're starting to, be able to see the light through the fog at least, right? So they've been brainwashed for so long. It's Bryan Kohberger, he's Ted Bundy and all this crap. And then when they finally start looking at actual evidence and they see that, there's about 15 pieces of evidence that they created DNA profiles from for individuals that they've never identified, but they had a good enough profile where they actually did likelihood ratios with everybody in the case, supposedly that they had listed as a suspect. We'll talk about that more later. But I mean, a ton of people that they cleared, all the Jack D's, the Showalters, and lists of people they compared against all of these pieces of evidence, and they excluded them. And what's interesting is the only piece of evidence that we ever were privy to during the entire buildup to this case or to the trial was the DNA on the knife sheath and unknown male B, C, and D, because the defense brought that up, and the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. And why do you think the DNA under Maddie's fingernails were brought up? See, in people's minds out there, and this is where the fog is going to have to clear, they're starting to be able to see it, but not really. But when you actually go through the forensic reports, you'll see that there's DNA under, and we already knew this because of the prosecution's reason for for their argument against the alt perps. Because in their argument against the alt perps, they said, look, they've been cleared from all this evidence. Yeah, well, Kohberger had as well. But the only piece of evidence that we ever heard litigated was the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. And why is that? Because out of all of those pieces of evidence, it was only the DNA under Maddie's fingernails that the likelihood ratio even met the threshold for the Idaho State Lab to be considered inconclusive. And that is what they used in the grand jury indictment to imply that Kohberger could have been one of those contributors. They had to do an outside evaluation, and that's what was litigated, to determine that Kohberger was actually excluded from that sample as well. But it wasn't because that was their best sample and their only other piece of evidence. It's because that was the only one, based on their likelihood ratios, that Kohberger couldn't be fully excluded from until an independent analysis was done. But Kohberger was fully excluded from about 15 pieces of evidence. They were equally as impactful as the DNA under Maddie's fingernails, DNA under Ethan's fingernails, Xana's fingernails, blood in the house. I mean, all of these things, blood on the back of the knife sheath. All these things were used to exclude people. And when they use them to exclude people, then that means it wasn't those people. And it was real evidence that they were using to exclude them. Kohberger was excluded from everything. Right now, they're still focused on the DNA under Maddie's fingernails. Well, no. You're going to find that over time, maybe not too long, they're going to start coming to the realization that, wait a minute, there's a bunch of evidence that Kohberger was excluded from. In fact, all of it, including the fingerprints, even though they're going to try to say he was inconclusive on those as well. I'll be doing a long, very detailed video on the L5 fingerprints here real soon. But it's interesting how they're starting to come out of the fog. As I showed you in the clips in the beginning of this, you've got old McDonough over there. So he's looking at all this evidence now, and he was a former homicide investigator, but he's still looking at it through the lens of, well, Kohberger's guilty, and because of his buddy Bricado, Kohberger's Ted Bundy. I mean, he's literally still got that brain block. But as he's looking through things, his brain block is starting to kind of fade a little bit, and he's going, well, it turns out it looks like there's probably another investigation going on with the HIDA group, which is high intensity drug trafficking. He's describing the OCD ETF and the investigation they had going on with the drug trafficking, and they thought it was a drug hit. He's starting to come around and finally open his eyes just a little bit. So it tells me that things are going to progress a lot faster from this point forward. Because when you go to court TV on the other side and you've got, Vinny starting to go, hey man, wait, there's none of these evidence, none of all this stuff, none of it links to Kohberger. And then he gets his FBI guy on there and says, all this evidence, shouldn't they have found something? And what does he say? Well, it turns out that, he was probably wearing a hazmat suit. A hazmat suit, man? So now we got Kohberger parking his car, getting out, putting on a hazmat suit. He's got a knife in this hand, a sheath in this hand. He's got a hand growing out of his butt that's holding some type of bludgeoning weapon. And he's got another hand coming out of his butt that's obviously some way to break into a house. So he is an octopus going in this thing with all the lights on, 8 cars out front, full of no telling who, and he's ready to go in there and go to town. Give me a break. The ridiculous stuff that they're starting to say is going to start sounding ridiculous to even them pretty soon, because they're starting to come out of the fog. And listening to McDonough, I was like, man, McDonough, come on, man, you're so close, brother. You're starting to get there. I wish I could help him get a little bit further. And let me just play a little clip because it was music to my ears,
Okay, you have the lab work still going 1,000 miles an hour. You have fingerprints coming in, case file prints. And by the way, they're also trying to access the Department of Defense fingerprint database. And I think it's for that Army guy, they're thinking, okay, we got to eliminate this guy. So they're trying to get into that database as well. And that's why probably his name is blacked out in a lot of these reports. Okay. The Army guy that they're trying to get the prints through DOD, if it's, whatever that guy, I forget his name, Kilpatrick or something like that. You got a drug train going because they think it's a drug hit. Okay. And then you have this other train that's going, well, because it's a drug hit, we really don't need to go canvassing that stuff right now. It's not a priority. What do you got? Well, we've got a name, 2 names. And what we want you to do is check to see if a guy by the name of Bryan Kohberger and then the other name above, which I don't know who that's going to be. It's probably the Army guy. Okay, the drug guy. Okay. And the lab says, okay, fine, submit the evidence. What do you have? Well, check it against this knife sheath. Item number 1. Okay, no problem. So now here's a question. Where'd they get this name on the 5th of December?
And that last part, he said, my friends, is the $50 million question. Because when these reports were first released, I did some members videos as I went through these reports, and some of the first reports I went through on day 1 was the lab receipts, especially the ones that listed Bryan Kohberger's name on December 5th. And then I noticed in further lab receipts, it listed Bryan Kohberger's name, and then it listed above his name Bryan Christopher Kohberger. And then above his name, there was still a suspect that was always blacked out. Now, my assumption, and this is where I know a little bit too much about this case and the shenanigans that have gone on, where I think 3 steps ahead, and that does hinder me in some cases. Because I said, look, I know they didn't have Bryan Kohberger's name on December 5th. And because when they do put Bryan Kohberger's name in this report, they put it in there twice, Bryan and Bryan Christopher Kohberger. So my assumption was, look, they've gone back to this report and they probably covered Brent Kopacka's name with Bryan Kohberger. And they've just typed it in there before they released these reports to throw everybody off. Not really thinking about the impact that them releasing those documents with Bryan Kohberger's name listed in there, what it could really have. And let's take a look at that report, because whether they have gone back and typed Kohberger's name in there over Kopacka, or that was actually Bryan Kohberger's name and they just didn't redact it way back on December 5th, the impacts of either way, because they've released this stuff to the public like they're legitimate documents that were just redacted. By releasing those to the public, whether that's originally said Kohberger's name or not, now they've created a airtight case for probably the entire conviction to be thrown out, y'all. That's how big it really is. And now that I grasp the concept of what that really is, I got to show you how big it is. I mean, this case is over. It's over. Let me show you why. All right, so what he's referring to is this Idaho State Police Forensic Services evidence submission receipt. And it was on December 5th, and it lists Bryan Kohberger right here as a suspect. Now, you can see I even had Kopacka in there, and when I went through these, I told the members, I said, look, all they've done is they've superimposed Bryan Kohberger's name over Brent Kopacka trying to hide this stuff. And it's very strange, because when you look at the suspects right here, it lists 2 suspects. One actually typed out Bryan Kohberger, which now that they've done this, I mean, they have utterly destroyed the entire case for themselves. And I'll show you why. Then it lists all these suspects or subjects. But this is an evidence submission receipt. Putting this on here really didn't have anything to do with what the submission receipt was for this particular evidence on December 5th, because it's a 5-page report. And then when you go down to what they were actually submitting, it's submission number 7, they were submitting buccal swabs from Jeremy Regan, Coy Nguyen, Derek Abenganya, Patrick Buechner, and Cora Jalibu. And that was it. That was all they were submitting in this particular submission receipt, was these guys' buccal swabs into evidence. So having Bryan Kohberger right here on December 5th, well, that isn't too bright for them. And then as you continue to go through, like the next evidence submission sheet, you'll see they only list 1 suspect, and Kohberger's not in there. And the box doesn't even, match how big Kohberger's was. And with my members, I actually took screenshots of these boxes and superimposed them just to make sure everything lined up. And yeah, so this one never appears again until much later when Kohberger appears with, I think it's on is it the 23rd? Let's look real quick. Let's see, here's the 28th. Well, they still don't have him on there. Let's see, where is it? Oh, right here. So it doesn't appear again until January 6th. This is after he's been arrested. And now we've got 3 suspects on January the 6th, right? Kohberger's already been arrested for the crime, but we still got suspect over here. We've got another suspect here. And they list the second suspect as Bryan Kohberger, and then they list the third suspect as Bryan Christopher Kohberger. So when I looked at this, I said, well, this has always been Brent Lee Kopacka, and they just went back and typed Kohberger's name on it. But whether they did or not, or if it originally said Bryan Kohberger, they have utterly destroyed their own case. And what was this submission? Major crime prints for Dylan Mortensen. Hairs found inside Kohberger's shower drain. Dark red swab, presumptive blood. Yeah, this is a counter swab, not from the King Road residence, y'all. This is a counter swab from BK's apartment, and cutting of a reddish brown stain on BK's pillow. So, and that's why a lot of people are pointing out swabs taken from a kitchen like it's the King Road house, and that's why you got to really go through the evidence with a fine-tooth comb. A lot of those swabs they took from a kitchen was actually Kohberger's kitchen, and it's not evidence of the crime. There was never any evidence connecting Kohberger to the crime. I've been through every report. So, and you can see they go through Bryan's mattress pad, seat back cushions, and everything. Major crime prints from Bryan Kohberger. This is on January 6th, though, 2023. And again, they've got 3 suspects listed, and they just went ahead and named 2 of them Bryan Kohberger. So that's why I assume that one on December 5th was just Kohberger typed over Kopaka. However, since they did that, whether it's real or whether they fabricated it, it's all over, and this is why.
First, the affidavit. What did you rely on in the affidavit you wrote for the first AT&T search warrant on December 23rd, 2022?
It was a conglomerate of interviews, data received from cell phones, my observations of some surveillance footage that was taking place, various other things. Go down the line. If you could be more specific on specific parts, I'd be happy to tell you what I'd like.
Okay. There was a part of the affidavit where you talked about WSU officers identifying white Elantras.
Yes, ma'am.
And there was a part of the affidavit where you talked about 2011 to 2013 Elantras, and then it expanded to 2016 to include the year of 2016 Elantras.
Yes, ma'am.
What I want to know first is what you relied on to expand that search from 2013 to include 14, 15, and 16.
That information was provided to FBI Special Agent Imel. He's a vehicle identification specialist. He used snapshots from the previously mentioned surveillance videos, and that was his determination on the types of vehicles we should be looking for, rather the year range we should look for. It would be in his report, it would be more specific, but that was what I based the affidavit off of, that portion of it.
I understand as far as when we get to 2013, but when we go beyond that, what did you rely on to get beyond that?
It would have been his input as an expert in vehicle identification. That's what we relied on.
Part of your affidavit talks about WSU officers finding white Elantras. And I believe there was an officer that you had some communication with. Do you recall the date you had that communication?
I do not recall the date. No.
Did you have some messaging system exchange with this officer to talk about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that the only means of communication you had with this officer?
No, ma'am. I believe I spoke to him on the telephone as well.
When you spoke to him on the telephone, how did that relate to the date of the messaging?
It would have likely been, if memory serves, it would likely been that same day.
Okay. Does December 20th, 2022 sound familiar to you?
Yes, ma'am.
And so this conversation with this officer from Washington, it related backwards to when he noticed an Elantra. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
But when he noticed it, you didn't know about that yet. Is that also correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so you don't know about him or talk to him until December 20th, 2022, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so here's the transcript from the January 23rd closed hearing on Franks, and Ann Taylor is questioning Brett Payne. And right here is Brett Payne on the stand in testimony stating, in the course of your responsibilities with Moscow police, this is Ann Taylor actually asking, In the course of your responsibilities with Moscow police, were you handling an investigation involving homicides at 1122 King Road? Yes, ma'am. What was your role? I was assigned lead detective after about the first 24 hours in that case. And does that mean that you have responsibility for the case and evidence? Yes, ma'am. Good grief, she could have been setting this thing up right here. Okay, as such, did you participate in a search for a suspect? Yes, ma'am. And when was the first time you heard Bryan Kohberger's name? The first time I heard Bryan Kohberger's name was December 19th, 2022. And what was that a result of? That was a result of investigative genetic genealogy that was being undertaken by the FBI. We had a phone call that evening and we were told Bryan Kohberger's name. And before that, Mr. Kohberger was not on your radar? No, ma'am. Before December 19th, was the FBI cast team member co-located with you? Yes, ma'am. How long had he been co-located with you? I don't remember exactly, but it had been several weeks at that point. And was that Nicholas Balance? Yes, ma'am. What other FBI team members were co-located with you? Goodness, a lot. We had technical assistant Maria Tyndall, Special Agent Jacobson, numerous other FBI special agents that were there to assist. And some of those included Michael Douglas and Ryan O'Neill. By the time it was December 19th and you first heard of Bryan Kohberger's name, had you reviewed videotapes? Yes, ma'am. How many hours of videotapes do you think you reviewed? I don't remember. My point is, she goes through and gets Brett Payne to say over and over, December 19th was the first time he ever heard Bryan Kohberger's name. No other way had Bryan Kohberger's name came up. And she made sure to ask him, does that mean that you have responsibility for the case and evidence? And he said, yes, ma'am. So when you go back to this State Police Forensic Services evidence submission receipt, and it has Bryan Kohberger's name listed as a suspect on December the 5th. Well, that means the lead detective in the case has just perjured himself in court twice now. And that would also mean that the prosecutors that were clearly involved throughout this case since day one intricately have lied as well.
Yes, when we heard the name on December 19th, at that point, that's really all we had was a name. And it was a new name. It was a name I'd never heard before. No one on our team had ever heard before.
So do you realize what this means? It means that for all of you out there that have supported Bryan Kohberger's innocence throughout this thing, it's over. It's absolutely over. Because it doesn't matter at this point if they doctored the paperwork to release it to all of us, or if that truly did have Bryan Kohberger's name on December 5th. Once they released it to the public, there's no going back on it. If they doctored it, they're not going to admit to that because that's malfeasance. And because there is a evidence receipt with Bryan Kohberger listed as a suspect on December 5th, and the lead detective in the case has testified twice that they never received Kohberger's name until after December the 19th. The prosecutors that were heavily involved in the investigation, you can read all the documents that says they were since the beginning, especially around evidence. I mean, they were making decisions on consuming entire samples of DNA. They were making the decisions, not the lead detective in the case. They were. And they go on national TV and say, yeah, nobody on our team heard Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th. And now there is an actual piece of evidence that's been released that lists Bryan Kohberger as a suspect on December 5th. Well, there's one of two things that'll happen now. I mean, it's there. Either They withheld that evidence of that receipt from the defense the entire time. And that is malfeasance because it goes against what they testified to in court, which means they lied. They will overturn this ruling against Bryan Kohberger. Or if they did provide the defense the receipt and the defense failed to file a motion after everybody perjured themselves on stand, then it is a clear case of ineffective assistance of counsel. Either way, the case is over. Bryan Kohberger will be released due to this. Mark my words. It's just a matter of time now, but it's weird because it's almost too easy. I mean, it's almost too easy, and it makes me suspect of the entire situation because it's that easy, if you know what I mean. But regardless of that, the Kohberger angle is over. Kohberger will be released over this issue. It's 100%. The Kohberger angle of this case just got wiped completely out of it. Insane. I also want to mention this because in a video I did yesterday, I read my comments, and one of my folks in there was commenting is the vitamin supplements. And I read your comment, and I noticed you said in there that I was dogging your video. I just want you to know that I've never seen your video. I didn't know you made videos. I'm gonna find it though. And I know you've commented on my channel forever. So if you made a video, I certainly, wouldn't go out and try to dog it out. So for those of you out there, just so you know, the vitamin supplement, any videos that they do, they've been with me for a long time. I endorse them all. So I apologize if you took something I said in a video like I was dogging your video, but I assure you I've never seen your video, and I endorse it, whatever it is, because I know you're a good person. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, your thoughts, your criticisms. Till next time, this case is over. Pavarotti's out.